So, as you guys know, I like my classes to be interactive. So I'm going to be talking about stuff, but I'm also going to be asking you guys, and if you can, have your camera on and interact with me. First of all, let me change my name. I'm not Jodi. I think most of you know that, but let's just make it official. I am Lori. And again, it's amazing how many times I spell my name incorrectly when I'm typing it. All right, so setting expectations with the seller. When do we want to set expectations and how do we do that? That's a question for you guys.
I'm sorry, could you say the question one more time?
Yes. When do we set expectations with the seller and how do we do it?
Right at the beginning of in the listing presentation.
That's a great time to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
What type of expectations are we setting?
I like to talk about work ethic. I mean, as far and trust amongst each other.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Expectations with the market, expectation with the seller, what's going to happen throughout like each stage of the process, where the most work is going to be put in, where the least work is going to be put in, and what they need to do on their part. And when you get to the negotiations as well, what to expect there. And then when you're closing escrow.
Yeah, exactly. So we want to set expectations with anybody that we're working with, whether it be a buyer or a seller, but we're specifically talking about sellers today. Things come up in a transaction, like they don't always go smooth. It's nice when they do, but sometimes the road can be a little bit bumpy. And experience shows that a seller is more accepting of the bumps in the road if they have some sort of expectation that we might have encountered them in the first place, right? When I do my seller net sheet, for an example, I always put in, it depends on the house, but I always put in about $3,000 in repairs. And the reason I do that is so that when we get to the part where the buyer's asking for repairs, I can remind them, okay, so we had this in the net sheet, we were already kind of expecting this. And if we don't need to have $3,000 in repairs, maybe they don't ask for any repairs, that's great. The seller, that's just like a bonus for the seller, right? So we want to set expectations, and the way we do that is through conversations with them. And so we want to make sure that when we're having our listing appointment or anytime we're talking to them about wherever we are in the process of the transaction, that we're setting the expectations for the next step, right? Okay, so let's talk about the listing agreement to begin with, and then we'll talk about expectations and conversations as we go. Let me share my screen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to fill out the listing agreement, but what I really want to talk to in the realm of that is what conversations am I having with the seller at each different part of the listing agreement, not necessarily like how we fill it out and what goes where, although some of that will be part of the conversation. As we go along, if you have any questions, just let me know, because I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have. So first of all, how do you guys feel as far as your comfort level of filling out a listing agreement? You guys feel comfortable with that? Have you never done it before?
Pretty comfortable. I wanted to ask real quick, is the new listing agreement, is it automatically set to non-exclusive, or is it exclusive still?
That's a good question. Let's see. It's exclusive.
Okay. Because I know the new BRBC is set to non-exclusive, right? And you have to check the box for exclusive.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And we do recommend that you check the box for it to be exclusive, but that will depend on, your business practice and your client and the needs, but we do recommend to work exclusively with them or have them work exclusively with you. Okay, so one thing to note is when I came into my transaction today, I have this transaction saved as a test transaction that I use when I'm teaching classes. And it had the listing agreement in there. And so I clicked on it to open it up, and it was the old version of the listing agreement. So if you have saved transactions and you're going in, make sure that you're getting the most updated forms. I thought it would automatically update, but it didn't. And the way you can tell whether you have the most recent one is it shows right here, revised July of 24. Now that doesn't tell me that I have the most recent one, because who knows when the last revision was, although in this case, we do know it was in July, but that's how you know what version of an agreement you have. So one of the things that they did when they changed the listing agreement and the buyer rep agreement is they took, so you have the listing agreement, but then you have a bunch of disclosures and advisories that are automatically attached to it, right? And it used to be that some of them were before the listing agreement, some of them were after the listing agreement. And what they did is they took almost all of those and they put them after the listing agreement, which I appreciate that they did that. But there's one form that they did not. There was one form that they kept at the beginning. And that is this one, this agency, disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. And anytime you have a client sign something, whether you're sending them the listing agreement, the purchase agreement, a buyer rep agreement, it's going to have this form first. Do you guys know why this form is always first?
To set expectations.
Yeah, the state of California takes agency very seriously. And so right up straight from the beginning, this is the first thing that they're going to get, the first thing that they're going to hopefully read, and then the first thing that they're going to sign. And so a couple of things I wanted to point out on this form to you guys. So just about the first sentence on the form, it says when you enter, this is to the buyer, in this case it's to the seller, but buyer seller. When you enter into a discussion with a real estate agent regarding a real estate transaction, you should from the outset understand what type of agency relationship or representation you wish to have with the agent in the transaction. So that's the very first thing that a buyer or seller would potentially read. Here it says either the purchase agreement or a separate document will contain a confirmation of which agent is representing you and whether that agent is representing you exclusively in the transaction or acting as a dual agent. Now, a dual agent is developed. Is dual agency on the agent level or the broker level?
Broker.
It's on the
It
broker.
could be both, no?
It
Like-
could be both. It could be the same agent is representing both buyer and seller, and so that would definitely be dual agency, but it's really figured out because like I have, whether I'm representing buyer or seller, I still have the same broker, right? So it's actually determined on the broker level. And not just Keller Williams, but it's actually done by the DRE number. So if I'm with Keller Williams and you're with Keller Williams and our brokers have different DRE numbers, then it's not dual agency. It's only if they have the same DRE number.
Yeah, so I mean, I did a open house for somebody that's in the brokerage here, and then acquired as a buyer, and we closed. But on the thing, it was the dual agency because both of us were from the same broker.
Yes, yes. And you might not even though you're from the same broker, like you might not even know the other agent. You may have never met them, but it's still considered dual agency because you share the same broker. Okay, and then one last thing I want to say on this form, the law requires each agent with whom you have more than a casual relationship to present you with this disclosure form. That's why this form is first. We have a legal obligation to present our clients with this form and to get it signed. Now, so this says that in the transaction, we are going to disclose to buyer and seller whether it's a dual agency or not, right? So let me ask you this. And Sebastian, I see your hand. I'll get you in just a second. When we come down to the listing agreement, where in the listing agreement are we disclosing that it is a dual agency or single agency transaction?
That would be in the terms.
This is actually a trick question. I want you guys to think, and thank you for answering that, Sebastian. It's actually not in the listing agreement because at the time we're taking the listing, we don't know who the buyer is going to be, and so we don't know whether it's going to be dual agency or not, right? But one of the things that I see when I look at the purchase agreements is on the first page where it's, you guys know where it has the boxes where you put the seller's agent, seller broker, buyer agent, buyer broker, and then it's got those boxes underneath whether you are identifying whether you're dual agency or which one you're representing. I see those boxes be left blank a lot of times, and we want to make sure that we're not leaving those boxes blank because those boxes are identifying, that's the way that we're telling the clients whether it's agency or not. And this form right here says that we're going to, and again, this form is very important to the state of California. So make sure we're doing that. Sebastian, what was your question?
I was actually going to comment exactly what you said about how at first when you're signing the RLA, you don't know if it's a dual agency because you don't know about the buyer. And then how you said about the RPA, that's when you know if it's a dual agency.
Correct. Okay, so let's get into the listing agreement. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'm just going to kind of go through the grid part of it, which I love that they made this grid so it now matches the RPA and everything's like right there in one spot. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. Let me know if you have questions, and then we'll go and we'll discuss certain parts in a little bit more detail. So first of all, date prepared would be today. The top part, who the seller is, what the address of the property is, what the parcel number is. And then we come to number 2. And number 2 is actually this whole grid, right? This is all part of paragraph 2. So under paragraph 2, A1, we're identifying the listing period. Now, I know it says on here, so try not to read it if you haven't done so already, but what is the maximum listing? What's the maximum amount of time that a listing can be for a residential 1 to 4 unit property for a traditional seller?
2 years.
How many?
2.
2. Do you guys agree with Josiah?
I thought it was
So unless
1.
they changed it.
So it's actually 2 years. What they changed was the BRBC. Do you guys know what the maximum length of time a buyer rep agreement can be?
90
More
days.
than 3 months.
3 months, right?
Yeah. And I'm not exactly sure if it's 3 months. It is 3 months, but I don't know if 3 months encompasses like the 90 days or the exact number of days, but generally speaking, 3 months. But the listing
3
period
months.
can be up to 2 years. What do you guys normally, or what have you heard that a listing period should be, or what do you guys take your listings for? What length of time?
Isn't it like 6 months?
6 months, yeah.
Yeah, I usually do mine for 6 months. But it can be, it can be whatever it needs to be. I do have a recommendation on the ending date. And some of you have probably heard me say it, but what do I recommend that the ending date of a listing be? Anyone know?
The
I think
last
on a
day of the-
Wednesday.
The
That's
last
closing
day of
date.
the month.
So ISIS, the Wednesday is when we're writing a purchase agreement and when we want it to close. So points for that. Last day of the month. Why do I want it to be on the last day of the month?
That way you remember that your leasing agreement is expiring.
Yeah, because when we are all mega agents and we have 25 listings going all at the same time, it might get confusing if we have listings that hopefully are not expiring, but that expire on different days. One's expiring on the 7th, the other on the 12th, another on the whatever. If all agreements expire at the last day of any given month, we only have to check that once a month. So I always make it 6 months ending on the last day of the month. Okay, then we have our listing price. And then we have, if it's a mobile home or a probate, we're going to attach additional forms. Then we come to compensation. And this is the part that's got all of the, all of the trainings and all of that, because this has changed dramatically. But I want to skip over this part for just a minute, and then I'll come back to it. So I just want to finish it here. Okay, so then Then we have 2D. So 2D has items included, items excluded, anything that's leased or liened, and if there's any smart home features that should be included or excluded. If there are smart home items, smart home features like a Ring doorbell or something like that, what do we need to tell? Let me see. Nat, I think there might be an echo. I'm not sure if it's on yours or not, but thank you. So if there's like a Ring doorbell, for example, and it's going to stay with the house, what do I need to make sure the seller's aware of on that?
Would it be that it's included in the RLA and the included items?
So yeah, we would put it here. We would mark it here as being included. But smart features sometimes, were you going to say something, Ernie?
I was gonna say you got to provide all the codes and stuff,
Yes.
or change them up.
Codes.
Provide all the.
Yes, codes and passwords and all of that. So if any smart features are staying, make sure that your seller knows that they're going to have to provide that information. And if they're like me, where they can't hardly remember their passwords when they need to log in, then they need to start figuring that stuff out, right? Okay. So I had a transaction a while back, and they had a home office, and in the office they had this really cute, super cute ceiling. It was like a ceiling fan, but it was like a chandelier light, very modern, very cute. They wanted to keep that. Okay. And so as I'm going through the house with them and I'm at the listing appointment and they tell me that they want to keep that chandelier or that light fixture, what conversation should I have with them?
To remove it or replace it with something else
Okay.
before showing the house,
And why do we want to do that?
because then it's not. There's not going to be any issues or any confusion in the whole transaction.
Yeah, so like the buyers don't figure that it's with the house, like it's not even on option because it's already gone.
Yeah. But what if I put in the MLS that seller reserves the light in the office?
Still, I mean, a lot of people don't read it all, including the clients.
Yeah, have it on the RPA.
Yeah. So first of all, yes, Ernie, I did advise them to take it down, and that way there's no chance that anyone's going to be confused on whether that's staying as part of the house or not staying part of the house. So if something can be removed before the photos are taken and before it's shown, that's the ideal situation if the seller's going to reserve it. That's not always possible. You know, maybe they're reserving the refrigerator, for example, which most sellers do, but you know, you're not going to remove your refrigerator just because you're taking with you, right? And so if they're not able to remove it, then we want to put it in the MLS notes, right? And we also want to make sure that, because the MLS notes they're not contractual, they're just notes. We want to make sure that if we get any offers that we are making sure to counter those items out, right? Whatever it might be. So if we're writing an offer and we see in the MLS that a certain item is reserved, it's good to put in our offer that seller reserves whatever taken from the MLS, because that way maybe that eliminates the need for the seller's agent to send you a counter offer and your offer can get accepted that much quicker, right? So we want to help other agents out, and if we know that something should be excluded, that's one way to do it. The other thing is, so we're writing it in here, and this is what it says right here: intended, items intended to be included and excluded. It doesn't say they're definitely going to be, it just says this is the intention, right? When I have a listing and I am doing reviewing offers, I always pull my listing out and I take a look at this section and I say, was there anything that I need to make sure is excluded or included based off of what the seller's intentions were? Now, what happens if we intend for that ceiling light fixture to be excluded? We put in the MLS, the light fixture is excluded, but we accept an offer and we did not exclude it. What happens then?
It's theirs.
it's theirs, right? Now we could always ask, say, hey, we messed up. We intended to keep that and see what they say. But sometimes they're going to just say, that's too bad. It was included. I wouldn't have offered what I offered if it wasn't included. And it's sold, right? Is the seller going to be mad at you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Is
Most
it
likely.
is it your fault?
Yes.
Is it the
Yes.
seller's fault as well?
They're
No.
supposed to review it, the contract too, no?
Yeah, it's a shared responsibility. And it says in here that if something, it says in here, you know, it's an intention and that the agent or the broker doesn't guarantee that something's not going to be, you know, that it's going to be excluded. So that would be a conversation to have with your client. Say, hey, I'm marking this down as it being excluded. And when we look at offers, I'm going to make note and make sure that it's excluded, but you need to be a second set of eyes for me when you're signing the offer and make sure that whatever you're intending is what actually happens, right? And so we can have that conversation. There are so many stories of agents who have ended up buying things for their clients because it didn't get properly negotiated into the actual contract, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Any questions on intended or excluded items? I mean, included or excluded items?
What
So all of
happens if
those-
you run out of space? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm just saying, like, what happens if you run out of space? Say they want to exclude more than 5 items.
You can do, yeah, there's no carryover here. I think that if you were to type this line so that it well, let me see. See additional list attached and then just like do this. Like, I think that would make it go to a text overflow addendum. And then the rest of it would be listed there. I've not actually tried that, but I think that's how that would work.
Yeah.
If not, then you could put it somewhere else, like down here is an additional terms. You could put it down here, like additional items to be excluded. On the listing agreement, it's not as important because it's just an intention, but on the RPA, it's definitely important because that's contractual. Okay, Ernie, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that all of that stuff right there is still negotiable. Like there could be a buyer that say, hey, no, I want that, and you know, on their offer. But and then as far as the seller goes, as a joke, and I've seen people do it, just when they move out, take the light and leave just something, you know, the wires hanging from the ceiling and let them deal with it, see what happens. But that's just, yeah.
All right, so it is definitely negotiable. Just because it's intended to be included or excluded doesn't mean that it has to be. And that's a good conversation to have with our clients as far as expectations of what something's going to look like if it's included or excluded or what that means. My dad bought a house one time and it had the plates where the light switches are and the electrical things. The whole house had like this country theme to it, including those, and they took those when they left. And my dad called his agent and they had to return them. So
That's liable.
yeah.
Because that goes along with that as is clause.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions on that part? Okay. So then MLS and public marketing just says that it's going to be in the MLS. There's going to be photos taking, timing of presentation of offers. I suggest leaving this to present all offers as received or as soon as practical. If we were to put offers shall be presented on, let's say, Monday, and then we don't get any offers, then it's a little bit awkward, right? So I like them to be presented as soon as received. Just because we present them doesn't mean that the seller has to respond back. So if I got an offer on day 1, seller doesn't have to respond back. Technically, by default language in the contract, they'd have 3 days to respond back. And so we could still wait a couple more days to see if we got more offers, right? But I can still present it to them right away.
Lori,
Yes.
on that comment, like they have 3 days to respond back. on the other side of the coin, the buyers have 3 days to cancel too, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, so a seller, like if you wait to, on these things for the specific date, they might withdraw the offer and move on. So you have a chance of losing a prospective buyer doing that.
Yes, and again, going to expectations, what might happen if we accept it right away? We don't get to see what other offers come in. What happens if we do accept it right away? Do or don't, I can't remember if I said that right. But again, explaining pros and cons. That's what I feel like my job is to explain the pros and cons of the decisions, and then seller gets to make the decisions, right? Or buyer, whoever the client is.
I forget who said it, but I heard a while back that usually the first offer is the best offer, or something like that, within that.
Yeah, I have heard that as well. I've never paid attention to whether that's true or not, but I'm also negotiating. So, if I get an offer, I'm hopefully negotiating up the next offers. So, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Then we get down to the buyer love letters. What do we want to tell our clients, our sellers about buyer love letters?
Nope.
Don't do it.
Don't do it, right? Why?
Because of
So you
fair
don't-
housing.
Yeah. So you don't steer the decision and, I forgot the formal term
Have a
for it.
potential lawsuit on your hands.
Yeah. So we're protecting them by not presenting buyer love letters, right? I don't know if buyers are even still sending those or not, but so by default, we're letting them know that we're not going to be presenting them, but they can instruct us to actually present them if this box gets checked. But it does say that they're acting against the broker's advice if they reference seller love letters. Now, I don't send buyer love letters. I don't send buyer love letters, but in my email, when I send an offer, I am putting a little bit of language in there, not necessarily in the form of a buyer love letter, but just stressing that my client is well qualified, that they're working with a good lender, different things. So I am trying to talk them up in the body of my email when I submit the offer.
So on that note too is setting up a relationship with the other agent and talking to the agent. Like, that's why I closed on this other one. Is just told him, I go, by the way, this guy, he's solid lender, and he's not he's not an investor. He's looking to stay in this thing the rest of his life. And she, just kind of, I just threw that out there, and she said, oh, good, our sellers would like to hear that. And I went on the other end going, yes, it worked.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So just kind of drawing that line though.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I do is I talk up myself as well. So, if it's an agent that knows me, then they know me. But if they don't know me, and sometimes I do sales that are in like a different county. And so I'm letting them know, I'm like, hey, you and I haven't worked together before, but I just want you to know I'm very responsive. Even though I'm an hour away, I'm still going to be there for all of the inspections, blah, blah, blah. So I'm selling myself in that email with my client's offer as well.
But you got to be careful what you put on paper in an email because it's documented.
That's true.
So
That's true.
yeah,
I'm not making stuff up. I am.
right. Yeah, but I mean, but any of that that fair housing stuff, if it's documented, if you put something on that across the line.
Yes. All right. Then we have investigation reports. If they're going to do any, we would mark that, and we can explain to them why it might be a good idea or why it might not be a good idea. I know in some of your areas, it's more common for sellers to do reports before they put it on the market. In other areas, like my area, it's not that common. But if they were to do a report, what is something that we would tell them about any investigations or reports that they do?
Can you say that again? Because you broke up. I didn't get all of it.
Oh, I'm sorry. If they're going to do any type of extra inspections or reports before they put their home on the market, what is something we would tell them in regards to that?
that we need to be able to give them to the buyer, to the buyer's agent if asked.
Yep.
Mhm. And then you also have to disclose anything that you find.
Yeah. So it becomes a disclosure item, right?
Mhm.
So let me ask you this. So, I live in my house. It doesn't have air conditioning. I'm thinking about putting it in. So I get a quote and it's going to be $10,000 to install air conditioning in my home. I decide not to do that. 3 months later, I decide I'm going to sell my house. Do I need to disclose that $10,000 quote to a prospective buyer?
No.
You guys agree?
No,
No.
Anyone think yes?
I'm saying yes.
Okay. Why yes, Michelle?
Just when I did a listing agreement, it does say any bids that you've had in regards to your house that you do need, whether you did the work or not, you do need to disclose it.
Yes. So it is a disclosure item. Just
That's not a mandatory thing on the home though. But I guess, I mean,
it's still a quote that you got. It's information you have. It could be material depending on the buyer, because maybe the buyer's planning on installing an air conditioning unit when they buy it, and they thought it was only going to be 5,000 to do it. Now it's 10,000, and they wouldn't have bought it, or they wouldn't have offered that price if they'd have known it was going to be that high.
Now, is there an exception if, like, let's say the quote was like done like a year ago or maybe 2 years ago?
So I'm not aware of any exceptions. I don't see any time limits on that. But that, what if it was 10 years ago, right? So there's not an official exception to it. And at the same time, if you notice I don't have it in front of me, and I can't remember if it's the SPQ or the TDS. It's one of the disclosures that the seller fills out for the buyer. One of the questions on there is, do you have any, reports, bids, quotes, etc.? And there's no time limit on that question. And so if the answer is yes, then those are supposed to be provided.
I think that's what Michelle was talking about, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I'm talking to a seller and they're like, well, you know what, I know that there's this issue, or that, we know that there's this issue. Do you think that we should have it looked at before we put it on the market? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, but I always want to tell them that whatever we find out becomes a disclosure item, regardless. And then if seller doesn't investigate it, then buyer would have the opportunity to choose to either investigate it or not investigate it, right? So sometimes not having information works to your favor. Sometimes it doesn't, because the other thing is, well, if we know that there's a repair that needs to be done and we know it's going to cost $5,000 or whatever, we can factor that into maybe what we list the price at, what kind of offer we're going to accept, whatever. And if we don't know what the cost of that repair is, we don't have the ability to factor that in, right? So just some things to think about and to, kind of discuss with your clients.
That's another expectation right there. Like, tell them that wait until the buyer does their inspections, but be ready if you know of any. I mean, if there's any possible big things to do that would reduce the price or give them credits. So that's conversation.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, definitely conversation. It's even like the pest report where they're looking for termites. Like in my area, it runs anywhere between like $75 and $125. So not a big expense. Not all, but most buyers will do a pest inspection anyways. And if we know that, because a lot of times, sometimes you can tell that there's going to be pest damage because you can see, you can see it. Other times you can't, and it hits you as a surprise. I have a client right now, they're spending $3,000 to have their home tinted. It was a little bit of a surprise to them because there wasn't obvious damage there. And when they negotiated the offer, if they knew that they were going to have to spend that $3,000, they could have negotiated a little bit differently. And by time that the buyer does the pest inspection and we find out it's a $3,000 repair, the sellers kind of lost a little bit of their power by not knowing that going in, right?
Mhm.
But, you know, conversation. If there's any exceptions to ownership or title, that would go right there. Seller intends to include a contingency to purchase a replacement property as part of any transaction. That would trigger another form, the SPRP. If they are going to have a contingency to purchase a replacement property, what kind of discussion do we want to have with them in regards to that?
I think you could talk with the seller about what coming soon might look like and just completely hold them off from moving forward until additional housing is provided for them, and then you guys could possibly move forward with the next steps of signing that RLA
Mhm.
and doing all that stuff.
Well, I would have them sign the RLA as soon as possible anyways, because I want to tie down that listing, right?
Mhm.
But what are some of the hiccups that can happen when when the seller has to purchase a replacement property?
It makes their
Well-
offer a little bit weaker than other offers who don't have a contingency on their home.
Mhm.
And also just the way the process goes, you want to have someone that's selling and buying, you want to have their home on the market first. And once they're in escrow, coming from Troy, the broker, he said once they're like 2 weeks into escrow or from closing escrow, then you want to go ahead and start looking at homes and getting to your next home.
So if their house is contingent upon, if selling their house is contingent on them buying a replacement property, then yes, it does weaken their offer. And the way that they make their offer stronger is by having their home in escrow by time they go look for an additional home. I don't agree with waiting 2 weeks. You want to start looking as soon as you can because there's timelines that go into there. This isn't a conversation about that particular form, so I don't want to go too much into detail about it, but there are definitely pros and cons if the seller has that contingency. And so we want to make sure that we're explaining that and how that process would work when we're doing the listing agreement, if they fall into that scenario. Yes, Ernie.
Yeah, I mean, you also discussed, I mean, you could do a rent back or something like that too. I mean, I think you can even offer that in the 30-day, 60-day, and then but you don't go past that or else because it's a different form, right?
The third,
But
yeah,
you
you
can
don't want to go past 29 days.
Right. So you offer that as well in there so you can find a house before that.
Yeah, and so there are options, right? Options that a seller has, but we're there to explain pros and cons because maybe they think they want to do it this way, and then when we explain why that might not be a great idea, then they might open up to another idea instead. Because maybe they don't have to sell the property in order to buy the next one; they just want to. So anyways, that's for another class, but that would be a whole nother place where we would have discussions with them. And then if there's any additional terms, then we could write those here on number K. And so that's basically what I want to talk about. I'm going to go back up to compensation, but you can see we come down here to number 4 and it starts talking about compensation to broker. And so I don't know if you guys know this, but like when we're looking at the listing agreement or the purchase agreement, like this is 2A1 and then it's got 4G here. Do you know what 4G means?
No.
It means if you go down into, see right here, it says paragraph number. If I go down into 4G down here,
Explains it.
find right here, it explains in more detail what number 1A is asking. So this is the term in the contract. So 2A1, 2B, 2C, but this is the paragraph in the contract that gives you additional details on that. Okay, so compensation. How many of you guys have been practicing your scripts around the compensation conversations? Good. Good. How many of you guys have had those conversations with clients yet? How did it go, Maria?
Well, one client actually, she understood, she's been in real estate, involved in real estate somehow. So I say, there is I charge 6%. And she's like, oh yeah, that's fine. I know it's 3% for you. You split it with the other agent. And I say, yes. And, right now with the new changes and everything, they just don't want us to put that on the MLS. And she's like, oh no, but that's how it should be. So I was like, okay.
So
And
that
she
was,
she even said, and I will be so happy if you would get both ends of the transaction. I was like, okay, that's great. That's the clients we want to have.
yeah,
Mhm.
definitely, definitely. I've had a few conversations with sellers about this, and the ones that I've worked with have been very responsive to the information and still fully see the value of offering compensation to the buyer's agent. One thing I will say, Maria, is you don't want to say that you charge 3%, I mean 6%, because now you're only charging 3%, because we can't negotiate. So we can't negotiate what the seller is going to pay the buyer's agent the way we used to, right? But let me ask you guys, what can we do in regards to setting up the seller's expectations around that conversation?
Well, I mean, explain cooperative compensation. Like you go back to the value squared thing that they did at the beginning, and I got it right here. It's just like, there's three fundamental choices for sellers. You can authorize to pay a cooperative compensation, don't authorize it, but be willing to consider it, or don't authorize it and don't consider it. And then explain the other those three things and say, which one do you want? Because if you don't offer it and don't consider it, you basically bring your buyer's pool down to people that can afford to pay it, for one, and also you're not going to get, there's a possibility of not getting a qualified agent to handle the transaction, or an agent at all to handle the transaction, and then we might not be able to close or as quick, or so it's just explaining that up front to them, and then say, which option do you choose?
I like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
That sets it up very, very clearly. So we definitely want to, even let's say that they don't want to, say they chose option 3, we're not going to offer it, we're not going to consider it. Does that mean that they won't get any offers that are asking for seller to pay compensation?
No, they can still ask. It's still going to come up, and then that's the great thing about it. But I don't know. It's just like negotiating price. It's the same thing, because you got those three different ways of doing it. And if you price it at market or below market, you bring more eyes to the property. So you have a better chance of finding a better qualified buyer, or a bidding war, making more money on the other end. So there's those discussions. You have 3 choices here, you have 3 choices here, and let them choose.
Yeah. But like you said, you want to explain the pros and cons of each option, right? So if I'm not going to
Yes.
consider it at all, I'm not going to consider paying buyer broker at all. What are the pros for that?
I mean, you're pinning down the one buyer that's gonna, have the transaction and be able to pay for all this stuff, and yes, cleaner, maybe cash offer.
I mean, I would say from a seller's perspective, if I'm a seller and I'm not in the real estate industry, and you ask me, hey, I don't want to pay the buyer's broker, let the buyer's broker pay it, right? In my mind, the positive to that is I'm going to make more money because I'm not spending money paying the buyer's broker, right? But that's a conversation we need to have. So why is it not true that you're necessarily going to save money by not paying the buyer's broker, right? And then that's where we're going to have that discussion. What are the cons? Only certain buyers are going to qualify now, right? Our buying pool has greatly shrunk when we take that stance. If I'm not paying the buyer's broker, Do you think I'm gonna get higher priced offers on my home or lower priced offers on my home?
Lower.
Lower.
Lower, right? As a seller, am I necessarily gonna know that right off the bat, or am I just gonna think that I'm
No.
yeah. And so that's our job, right? Because our job is to represent the seller in the best way possible, and hopefully net them the most amount of money. And so we've got to have these conversations, even if they initially say, no, I don't want to do that. I heard on the news that we don't have to do that anymore. We want to have those conversations about why it still might be a good idea to do it, right? Now, if a seller gets an offer and the agent on the other side is asking for 3% commission, and they have a BRBC that shows that they are committed to their buyer, you know, they have a contract with their buyer for 3%. What are the seller's options?
They
To give them
can
what the-
agree to, yeah,
Say
Go
it
ahead.
again.
go ahead, Ernie.
No, you go ahead. You were. You
I
were right. Go
believe,
ahead.
well, I believe they can agree to pay them, or I think it's offered in like concessions now or something,
Mhm.
right? And, or they can pay partial amount and then the buyer can come up with the rest of it. Or they can be offered in credits, I believe. Isn't credits and concessions the same thing?
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But my main point of the question, which you hit, Isis and Ernie, is that if a seller gets a offer and it's asking for 3% in concessions, I probably used the wrong term earlier, but in concessions to go towards the buyer's compensation, seller's not obligated to do the 3%, right? They could say, no,
Right.
we're not going to do any. They could say, we're going to do 2.5. We're going to do, you know, or maybe we'll do the 3, right? And so seller still has options based off of whatever offers come in, right? But at the end of the day, that does affect the amount that the buyer is going to end up paying. And so we still have the option of accepting or countering, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
See, that's what's cool about all of this is everything's negotiable, and it can change at any given point in time. That's why even on the BRBC, you're going to put 3% and agree on that. But I can say, hey, they're only offering 2.5. I'll give you the other. You know, so we'll take that. Don't worry about the other percentage or stuff. But it's I mean, if you're not getting any offers, you know, as a seller, and this guy comes in with a decent offer, but he wants 2.5%, it's like, hey, look, we might want to consider this. You know, so it's all different. Everything's different, you know, with each transaction and where the ways the rules are going, stuff, and how the house is doing, you know.
yeah.
So market dictates a lot of that.
Yes. And it's going to be interesting to see how this all ends up, you know, working out in the next few months. Once it
I think
all
everybody's overthinking it, to be honest with you.
possibly. So,
Lori,
yes.
I have something that I keep repeating myself. Like I have worked with people that is they are asking for anything extra to the seller. So they are not the funds that they dispose for the transaction is not so rich, let's say. How do you explain them that now they are going to pay your commission? How do you explain that? Like, I have something that maybe I don't trespass myself in thinking, how am I going to do that? They're just trying like, oh my God, I don't have money for the transaction. How do you suppose I'm going to pay you?
Yeah. So, I mean, those are conversations that every agent is gonna have. So it's not like they're gonna say, oh, Rufina's gonna charge me commission now. So now I need to go and find a different real estate agent because I'm gonna find one that won't charge me that, right? So it's across the board. Every agent's gonna be having that conversation. Now, the dollar amount or the percentage will be maybe different from what you charge versus what another agent charges. We do recommend that with these changes that you still charge the same amount that you were charging before. And I know as buyer agents, we didn't have control over necessarily what we were being paid. If it was just offered through the MLS, but we don't want to be discount agents just because now we have to have the buyer sign an agreement. So, you know, commissions are negotiable and don't discount yourself, right? I think that the real conversation there, and someone else can chime in as well, is that we can put that as part of our offer, right? So yeah, you're committing to pay me X amount of commission as, you know, with the BRBC, the buyer rep agreement. But when we submit an offer, we'll ask the seller to pay that. And if they don't want to pay that, or if they're not offering any type of
Cooperative compensation.
Then that's not the house and we'll find a different house. But the reality is we don't work for free, right? If they want representation, that comes at a cost. It's always come at a cost, so that hasn't changed. It's just now that the buyer is empowered to negotiate that cost for themselves instead of the seller's agent doing it. Would anybody
So
anything?
I keep going back. I don't know if you guys did anybody do the value square, Gary Keller? As far as the 4 seminars and stuff, but I keep going back. I mean, Rufina, that if you tell or explain or ask them, do you know how I get paid? And explain to them everything that you do and the value that you bring to the table, and then explain to them and we'll figure it out. Like Lori said, if you can't afford some of it, maybe we'll get it within the lender or with the buyer concessions or something like that. But start out right away. Do you know how I get paid? And this is how I get paid, and this is what I do for that money. So it kind of explains it, and then it makes it your value worth them saying, okay, cool, I got to figure this out, and getting you, working together and getting you paid. I don't know, does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
But that's the point, that they know that we don't work for free.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a favor that we're doing.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It's a work that we are developing on behalf of them.
Yeah. But then also though, if you do a good job of explaining yourself and explaining everything that you do and what you bring to the table, they're going to think that you're worth it. You've created your value. They're going to think that you're worth it, and they're not going to go want to find another agent because you've established that trust and educated them, so to speak. So.
And practicing your scripts around that conversation and objection handlers around that conversation, the more you practice that and become skilled at that, the better you're going to be at handling those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we all need to get good at. So one last thing before we end, we have 5 more minutes, is number C2, 2C2 right here, the additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer is unrepresented. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I charge, X percent. So just to throw numbers out there, I'm going to use the number 3. So I charge 3% to list your house, right? Mm-hmm. And there's the possibility that we're going to get a buyer who's going to come who doesn't have an agent and doesn't want an agent. And in that scenario, you don't have to take their offer, but if you do take their offer, I'm going to charge an additional whatever that percentage might be, because there's additional work that has to be done to deal with that buyer. Now, if you come down here, there is a form. The broker compensation advisory. and it explains some of that stuff. And so you can use this as like your script. You know, obviously you want to not read this to them, but take some of the information and use that to explain it. There was, let's see. So here, broker agreement with buyer. And so it kind of explains, you know, there was the nationwide class action settlement. Buyers are now required to have a written agreement, or agents are required to have a written agreement with the buyer. But anyway, so there are forms that are out here that are designed to help us with the conversations and help us explain, you know, some of the things that we need to explain to them. Yes, Matthew.
So in that case, do you technically become the buyer's agent? Do they have to sign the paperwork?
You don't. And so there, this is, go back here. It's specifically if a buyer is unrepresented. And so in that case, there is a form that you would send to the buyer. I forget the form name, but it's basically telling the buyer that you are not representing them, and that anything you do in behalf of that transaction is being done for the seller's benefit. It's going to be interesting because there's a line where we don't want to cross that line, because we're not working for the buyer, so we can't give the buyer any advice. But yet we still need to facilitate this transaction where the buyer might not know what the next step is, because, you know, we're used to working with agents who do know what the next step is, right? So it's going to be really interesting to see how that comes out. But one thing that we want to make sure is that it's different. It's a different workload if we're representing just the seller versus if we're representing the seller with an unrepresented buyer. And so we want to make sure that we're being compensated for that additional work. Now, let me ask you guys, what type of additional work am I talking about?
Just, I mean, all
Like
the freaking. Go
the
ahead.
forms, the contract.
All the contingencies, man. All the contingency releases and all that stuff.
And so we have to be careful there, because as a seller's agent, we normally send the forms and the contracts and the contingency removal forms, right? So we're still going to send those, but we can't advise the buyer on what those mean, right? We just have to say, here they are, sign them, you know, sign them and return them by they're due back by this date, or whatever the case might be, or, you know, release your contingency because this is the contingency removal date. But when they have questions, but wait, I'm not ready to remove it, like, we're not their agent, right? And so we cannot step into those shoes. But let me ask you this. So some of that won't really change, but what if they want to do an inspection, right? Are we just going to say, okay, buyer, here's the house, do the inspection? We're not, right? Now we've got to be there at the house while they're doing their inspection. That's something that their agent would normally do, right? So there's some additional time with, you know, being there physically for the inspections, or to let them in because they don't have lockbox to let themselves in, or whatever the case might be. And so those are the areas where it's going to create extra work. And we want to be able to explain that to the seller when we're negotiating what that extra commission amount will be. All right, so it's 12:30. So I want to respect your guys' time. So I'm going to go ahead and end. But so if you guys are good, then I want to say thank you. I hope it helped you. The more we practice our conversations, the better we'll be. And the more we set seller expectations, the smoother the transactions will go. If there are any burning questions, I will stay on for a minute or two just to answer those questions. But other than that, thank you guys for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you.